Who do you think you are? Some black woman in a white suit and pearls trying to act like a lady? You hear me? Hands up. I'm not saying it again. He shouted in her face like she was a criminal. He pulled his gun and pressed the barrel against her forehead, ignoring who she was. And just seconds later, he deeply regretted laying a hand on the wife of a United States Navy colonel. What about where you live? In your neighborhood, has anyone ever been treated like their skin color was a crime? Leave a comment, not just to speak up, but to make sure no one has to stand alone again. The parking lot at noon held no sunlight, only a searing heat rising off the asphalt. Rows of cars stood still, silent like machines biding their time. The automatic glass doors of the supermarket slid open, and Adrienne Rowe stepped out with a steady stride and eyes untouched by hesitation. She wore a cream-colored suit, a high-colored blouse, low heels, a neat handbag resting on her forearm, and a short pearl necklace that hinted at quiet stability and self-respect. One hand held a receipt, the other still gripping an uncased wallet as she stepped down the incline. Her head held high, her eyes straight ahead. She didn't glance around or slow her pace for any stare that might follow. She was walking toward her silver sedan when a sharp shout from the opposite direction tore through the still air like a sudden strike to the nape. "Stop right there, black woman!" Command cracked out, short and cutting, echoing across the lot like a slammed fist in an empty room. Adrienne froze for a second, startled. The voice didn't belong to a request, nor did it carry the professionalism of civil authority. It reeked of violence, wrapped in the shell of language. A man in a police uniform was walking straight toward her. His eyes held no inquiry, no caution, only the certainty of a decision already made. She was guilty, because of her skin. He marched faster, each boot step hitting the pavement with the force of a pursuer. He didn't flash a badge, didn't offer any request, didn't ask the standard question, "Excuse me, ma'am, could you stop for a moment?" The first thing he did as he approached was draw his gun from its holster and aim it directly at her forehead, at a distance close enough that she could see the scratch marks lining the barrel. "Hands up!" Adrienne didn't raise her hands. She had just exited a grocery store, the receipt still in hand. No alarms had gone off, no disturbance had occurred, nothing unusual, besides the trembling gun in front of her and an officer wearing the expression of someone who had finally found a reason to ruin his day on someone else's back. He growled, "You hear me? Hands up. I'm saying it one last time." She looked straight into his eyes, as if trying to find a trace of humanity behind the cold surface. But what she saw came closer to pleasure, the kind of pleasure taken in holding absolute control. He didn't look at her as a person. He looked at her as a threat to be eliminated. "I saw you sneaking around the aisles," he continued. "You think I don't know your kind's tricks? Fancy clothes, designer bags, acting all ladylike. For what? To hide something, isn't that right?" Adrienne didn't respond, because responding would mean acknowledging that his words deserved an answer. She shifted her body half a step, not back or forward, just enough to regain balance. He noticed and let out a sharp, short laugh. "Oh, you're scared now? Good!" The gun stayed pointed at her face. He stood less than an arm's length away. A breeze passed through the gaps of the parking lot, lifting a torn flyer that fluttered across his line of sight. He didn't flinch, didn't blink. His sole focus was the woman standing before him, a woman who wasn't screaming, scratching, or fleeing, and that irritated him. He needed her panic to justify his posture. "Got nothing to say?" he asked, tilting his head, his tone softening but still dripping with venom. "You think a rich husband and some nice clothes make me respect you?" Still, no answer. Adrienne's gaze held steady, a silent mirror reflecting every harsh angle of his aggression back at him. She didn't know what was coming, but one thing she was certain of: he couldn't see the person approaching from behind, and the distance between "I am holding a gun" and "I just made an irreversible mistake" was exactly 5 seconds. He looked Adrienne up and down like he was inspecting a piece of furniture he didn't approve of, then smirked, a short and malicious laugh. "Who do you think you are? A black woman in a white suit and pearls trying to play the lady?" His face twisted into a sneer, Adrian had seen too many times before, but never had it come in the form of a cold barrel aimed squarely at her. His voice scraped the air like the dull edge of a worn-out knife, dragging each word across the surface of dignity. His grin made no effort to hide the contempt, as if the ivory suit itself was an insult to his place in society. That look wasn't just about race. It was soaked in years of resentment, as though he was using borrowed authority to punish the life he would never live. He curled his lip again, lowered his head slightly, eyes drilling into her neckline as if appraising the value of each pearl. You people always think wearing something bright makes you look clean. To me, it's just another kind of dirty. Nothing was surprising about the filth in his tone. Adrian remained still, hands exactly where they had been, her head unbowed, her gaze unwavering. She refused to give him what he wanted, a frantic, begging woman scrambling for mercy. He was building a scene, and she wouldn't play the part. Her eyes became a mirror, exposing every crack in the facade of power he clung to. The parking lot had gone so quiet that one could hear a car brake at the far end of the street. A soft wind puffed her shirt slightly, stirring a few strands of hair against her cheek. She didn't reach out to brush them away. She was measuring him, every movement, every breath, every minor shift in how he held the gun. Something in his rhythm told her he didn't know how to control with words. He only knew threats and force. "What else do you have to be proud of now?" he said, stepping forward, his boot slamming against the edge of her heel. "Or maybe take off that necklace before I do it for you?" Every word spilled from his mouth like sewage from a broken drain. Adrienne didn't answer, because while he kept rambling, her eyes had already caught movement in the distance. A tall, solid figure in a white military uniform, walking in from the camera's blind spot near the third light pole. The man's stride wasn't fast enough to draw attention, but firm enough to bend the air around him. The officer didn't notice. He was too busy laying the next layer of his script. "I've dealt with ones like you before. That whole educated act is fake. Your heads are full of lies and resist." Adrienne still didn't look at him. Her eyes had locked onto the white shoulder fabric, the metals catching the rhythm of each step. The man was walking like he was inspecting a lineup. Steady, calm, deliberate. He carried no weapon, yet each footstep squeezed the space between Adrian and the barrel tighter. The cop stood square in the middle, back turned to the man, clueless that his safety zone was vanishing by the second. He kept talking. "When I ask you a question and you don't answer, that's contempt of law. Or do you think someone's coming to save you? Ain't no one around here gonna save your ass." Before he could finish the last word, a deep male voice came from behind, not loud, not angry, just clear like a fact finally about to come true. "You're pointing a gun at my wife." Adrienne didn't turn. She kept her gaze fixed forward, lips pressed lightly as if she knew exactly how long she needed to stay still for everything to unfold at the right time. Things had begun to shift, and from this moment on, control no longer belonged to the man holding the gun. His grip tightened around the gun. A faint hiss slipped from the cold barrel aimed dead center at Adrian's forehead, only inches from her face. He clenched his teeth and growled, "I've shot plenty like you before. You want to be another black corpse?" His voice no longer resembled language. It had become an abrasion. It slid through the air like a bullet seeking a new target. In his eyes was a kind of numbness born not of duty but of appetite. He didn't threaten to subdue. He threatened to savor each trace of fear, each twitch in the muscles of his victim, anticipating the first shot. But this time he saw none of it. Adrienne showed no signs of panic or fear. Her eyes held no fright. The only thing she did was tilt her head slightly, as if considering a thought that had just crystallized in her mind. She spoke, softer than a breath. "You're being recorded." Just 4 words. He paused for a fraction of a second, a sliver of hesitation, but real. Like a wild animal suddenly sensing it's being watched, his eyes flicked around, first to her hand, then to the parking lot, scanning light poles, roof corners, and the line of short trees. "Recorded?" he muttered, voice lower like he intended the words only for the two of them. Adrienne didn't move. Her stance was neither aggressive nor passive. It made clear she wasn't apologizing for being present, and she had no intention of asking permission to exist. A blink, then he began shouting again, louder, faster, as if trying to drown out that crack in his performance. "I don't care who's filming. You think some trash clip online is going to stop me? I've been recorded before. And what did you all think? That we're scared? I shoot, then I write the report. That's it." He stepped forward half a step. The barrel was now so close that Adrian could feel the dampness from his palm warming the metal. His eyes twitched, a hairline fracture forming in his usual certainty. Beneath the hostility, cracks of a man losing the high ground began to show. Adrian looked at him, not just with her eyes this time. She allowed a half smile. It wasn't mocking, nor submissive. It was the smile of someone who knew what was coming and didn't need to explain. She stood there, watching, like a mirror that didn't flinch. Behind them, the sound of deliberate footsteps grew louder. The officer hadn't noticed, too busy funneling his rage through the barrel. "Stay right there," he barked. "One move. That's all I need to pull the trigger." And that's when the camera will get one more scene to submit to the federal investigation, Adrian replied, her voice now clear, cutting into the tense air between them. His shoulders jerked. Hesitation crept into his breathing. "You don't know who's watching, do you?" she continued, voice steady. "Could be a witness, it could be a child, it could be someone in the control tower. Or maybe..." A single footstep landed close, solid, intentional. It shifted the mood without touching the ground hard. Adrian stopped speaking. He hadn't turned yet, but this time the gun didn't inch forward. And for the first time since stepping out of the store, Adrian lifted her chin slightly, eyes aimed just over his shoulder, where a white uniform had entered the frame, close enough to reset the entire equation. A voice spoke from behind, slicing through the charged air between muzzle and face. "She is not alone!" The tone was low, measured, and crisp, like a command issued from the bridge of a ship. Each word dropped with surgical precision, as though preloaded into a chamber and fired into the spine. The officer jerked his head around, a clumsy motion fueled by too much force, like a beast realizing too late it had turned its back on the real threat. About 5 meters behind him stood a tall black man in full white naval dress uniform, emerging from the shade. His frame was solid, broad-shouldered, carved by the discipline of a soldier who never needed to shout to be obeyed. His uniform sat perfectly aligned, metals gleaming across his chest, and the collar so sharp it caught the light like a blade. The atmosphere shifted the moment he stepped into the invisible frame of the scene. No one needed to say who he was or why he was there. The way he walked explained everything. The officer immediately tilted his gun to the side, not lowering it entirely, but no longer steady. His eyes darted between two directions, like a compass needle spinning wildly under too many magnetic pulls. The man took 2 more steps. Each footfall on the concrete landed with a sharp, clear sound like a striking bell. No one spoke, but it was easy to sense the officer was wondering, who am I dealing with? The man stopped about 6 feet from Adrienne and the officer, a perfect distance, not close enough to provoke, not far enough to be ignored. His eyes did not look at the weapon nor Adrienne. They locked directly onto the officer's gaze, as if he had already calculated every possible move. It was not the stare of an angry husband. It was the stare of someone who had seen too many injustices brushed aside and was done speaking gently. "What do you think you're doing?" he asked, voice steady as steel, each word struck with surgical clarity, needing no repetition. The officer faltered, his voice slipping. "I suspected the subject was behaving suspiciously." The man didn't blink. "She's holding a receipt and a shopping bag. You're holding a gun? Tell me where the suspicious behavior is." The officer glanced at the weapon in his hand. His finger was still on the trigger. He had been holding it like that since he first drew, and now his palm was beginning to sweat. He inhaled, trying to recover his toughness, but the strain in his throat was visible. "I'm performing my duty," he said, but the words had lost all weight. "Do you know who I am?" the man asked, his eyes finally shifting down to the badge on the officer's sleeve. "No," the officer replied, his voice much smaller. Good. Let me introduce myself. He pulled a card from his chest pocket, holding its front side up to the light. I'm Colonel Walter Jefferson, United States Navy, and the woman you just pointed a gun at is my wife. A sentence struck the air like a hammer blow. No one spoke. The officer squinted, unsure if he was trying to read the card or hide the panic beginning to surface in his eyes. Walter stepped forward by half a pace, just enough to stand beside Adrienne, maintaining a precise space between her and the officer. He didn't speak because she knew you wouldn't listen. I'm here to make sure next time you have to. Adrienne still didn't turn toward him. Her gaze stayed forward. A soft breeze stirred the sleeve of her suit, and in that brief instant she and Walter stood side by side like twin pillars, one silent, one speaking, but both anchoring the moment with the weight of their presence. The officer had already stepped back half a pace, without realizing it. The gun was still in his hand, but now it felt like an unnecessary object. He hadn't been ordered to drop his weapon, but in this moment, he was holding something he no longer had the right to use. Walter didn't need to speak again. Just standing there was enough. His posture alone was a command, and from this point forward, the story no longer belonged to the one holding the gun. Walter's gaze did not waver. He stood still, arms at his sides, his white uniform reflecting the afternoon sunlight so precisely that every crease across his chest appeared like a silent badge of authority. Yet it was his eyes, more than the uniform, that thickened the air around them. This wasn't the look of a panicked husband, nor that of a man seeking revenge. It was the gaze of someone forged by battlefields, by standing before hundreds of subordinates who obeyed without needing more than a glance. It carried discipline, clarity, and consequence without volume. The officer's wrist twitched. His fingers seemed to have reached the edge of a threshold he could neither cross nor confidently hold. Walter kept his eyes locked on him, as though tracking each breath. Then he spoke, soft, precise, each word laid onto the pavement like stone. If you keep that gun raised for 3 more seconds, your career won't have a single letter left. The sentence wasn't loud, but it landed with the weight of granite. The way Walter emphasized career didn't carry a threat. It resembled a finalized statement, waiting for the other party to acknowledge understanding. The officer froze. He blinked rapidly, lips parting, head tilting slightly, as if trying to scan the last few seconds for the boundary he had just crossed. The gun remained raised, but sensation had begun to drain from his palm. He stammered, the words tumbling out like a vehicle skidding on gravel. I thought her behavior, I was suspicious. Walter didn't flinch, didn't offer a smug grin like those who know they've won. He maintained the same posture, though his voice grew one shade colder. She's a doctor, she's my wife, and what are you? Besides a man wearing a gun to scare civilians. Every syllable landed in the narrowing space between them. Adrienne remained still, not turning her head, as if she had ceded the floor entirely to her husband, knowing, and the officer beginning to realize, what would follow if Walter chose to close the conversation with a single concluding line. The officer didn't answer immediately. The gun wavered somewhere between neutrality and guilt. He knew exactly whom he was up against, not just any man, but a senior officer with a record, influence, and reputation strong enough to turn that firearm into Exhibit A in a federal inquiry by sunrise. Walter took a half step forward, not close enough to provoke, but just near enough to create a wall, an invisible barrier between the man and Adrienne. Each movement he made was a warning, issued without inflection. What do you think you're doing? Walter asked again. No need to repeat himself. That simple question became a psychological exam. The officer blinked, glanced toward Adrienne, then back again. For a second, he looked like he might say something to salvage his position, but every excuse was strangled by the truth. He had just pointed a gun at the forehead of an unarmed woman, in daylight, without a warrant, without warning, and her husband was someone he never should have crossed. Walter didn't rush. He remained still, letting silence do the rest. The surrounding crowd began to take notice. A man nearby lifted his phone, camera raised, without a word. Someone paused beside a car in the distance, watching, as if recognizing a familiar scene, but this time watching it unfold far from the usual script. The officer lowered his gun. His hand trembled briefly, though his mouth stayed tight. Eyes down, weapon tilted away from firing stance, he stepped back half a pace. It wasn't a decision, it was the recognition of crossing a line and backing away from an irreparable mistake. Walter's stare didn't shift. "Good," he said quietly. "Now we talk like adults." And in that instant, the officer realized he wasn't facing a victim, but a man who could disarm him without lifting a finger. A phone beeped nearby, then another, then more, gentle but steady, like ripples over still water. A middle-aged woman raised her phone behind a bronze SUV, gaze sharp and still. Next to her, a young man stepped back to widen the shot, hands firm as the lens locked on the officer's face. An older man, leaning on a nearby car, shook his head and muttered, "Get it all. Don't miss the devil's eyes." Not emotion, just instruction from someone who had seen this before, but never seen it end like this. The officer now felt it, eyes on him. Not random stares, but people who knew what was wrong and were finally fast enough to catch it. To his left, a glowing red phone. Right, another screen. Behind him, in the car window's reflection, his image framed. No more quiet exits. Walter stood firm, arms relaxed, gaze locked. Adrienne still said nothing. She didn't need to. His presence alone had frozen the lot without a sound. The officer's grip weakened. The gun stayed up, but heavy. The authority he had flaunted, his right to shout insult, was crumbling. Control had slipped, not from a threat, but from the silence in front of him. He swallowed. A bead of sweat slid from temple to jaw. Wind moved gently. Phones kept glowing. The world had paused, leaving one light on these three. Walter tilted his head, said nothing. His eyes held no hate, no pride, only the unspoken question, will you step back or leave a stain that won't fade? The tension was in the stillness. Adrienne unmoving, Walter unflinching, the crowd waiting. All eyes watched one choice. Would the officer admit the mistake or double down? A boy whispered to his mother. She said nothing, just laid a hand on his shoulder. They didn't know the man, the woman's name, but they knew something was happening, a kind of resistance without words. The officer's hand shook again, another drop of sweat. Phones were still recording. Walter shifted his weight, barely, but it was enough. If the gun stayed up a moment longer, that clip, image, sound, truth, would scar the system forever. The officer snapped like something breaking free of restraint. He shouted, as if his voice could drown out the weight of every eye turning toward him. "I'm a cop! I have the right to detain anyone suspicious!" His voice echoed across the open space, bouncing off concrete walls and coming back at him. Dry, sharp, like a warning rising from the throat of someone losing control. His face flushed, lips stretched, forehead slick with sweat. He clutched the gun like a burden. He wasn't looking at anyone in particular anymore. He screamed to save himself from the situation unraveling before him. Walter did not flinch. His gaze stayed cold, untouched by the noise. He delivered his next line without raising his voice. "You detain people by pointing a gun in their face?" The question fell like a blade drawn and placed flat on the table, not to strike, but to make the other man face what he had just done. It was a simple question, but the weight came from the contrast. A man in uniform without a weapon, without shouting, calmly asking about the integrity of someone who claimed authority, yet held it like a threat. The officer gasped for breath. He meant to speak, but was interrupted by Adrienne's voice for the first time since it all began. "And what exactly about me looked suspicious to you?" She didn't raise her tone, didn't emphasize anything, but each word landed clean and sharp, like they had been arranged long ago, waiting for the exact moment to be spoken. It wasn't a question meant for an answer. It was meant to be heard across the entire parking lot, for every phone recording to capture not only the images, but the motive no report would ever document. He glanced at her again, this time from a place no longer above her. His eyes met the composure of the woman he had tried to criminalize. There was no denial he could offer now that wouldn't carry consequences. If he said it wasn't about race, then what was it about? If he claimed behavior, then which behavior? A woman in a suit, carrying a bag, walking calmly out of a supermarket in broad daylight? Adrienne stepped forward, just a small move. Still within a safe distance, but enough for Walter and the crowd to see. She didn't need to hide behind her husband. She didn't need a man to speak for her. She could speak for herself, and had chosen the exact moment to say something undeniable. "I'm a doctor. I just got off my shift. I came to shop. I paid. I walked out. What about me was suspicious?" Adrienne held her gaze on the officer's face, not retreating. "Or was it because I didn't lower my head?" The officer pressed his lips together, his eyes clouded. No stance remained solid. The people filming didn't lower their cameras. Every second now was evidence. Every expression he made was a timestamp. Every word he uttered was a bridge between action and justification. Walter looked to his wife, then back to the man. He didn't need to add more. The facts were set, the angles framed, the silence filled with truth. If anything remained in motion, it was only the officer's desperate attempt to find an honorable escape from the pit he had dug. He stepped back. The movement was no longer reflex, it was a decision. His hand still held the gun, but it pointed downward now. He looked around, saw an elderly man still filming, a little girl clutching her mother's shirt, and sunlight catching the metals on Walter's chest like a verdict rendered without a gavel. Adrienne lowered her voice, just enough for him to hear, but no one else. "You could choose to stop here. Before the title on my chest outweighs the badge in your hand." But Walter didn't repeat it. He simply waited. And in that wait, the balance of power had shifted completely. No longer did it belong to the man who yelled he had the right, it belonged to those who had never raised their voices, but whose every word now left marks no one could erase. The officer's voice scratched the air like a key scraping stone. Still laced with bravado, panic, and denial, he tilted his head toward Adrienne, lips curling into a twisted grin, part defiance, part fear. "So what if your husband's military? I've pointed guns at generals before. You believe that?" He spoke like a man clinging to the last scrap of power, even as every retreat had exposed the truth. His words weren't for Adrienne. They were thrown into the air, hoping someone still feared him, but the response came from the crowd. "I believe," a voice said from the right. "We believe," the man repeated, stepping forward. His weathered face and knowing eyes made it clear he didn't need to explain who he was, because your face smells of innocent blood. The officer flinched, startled, scanning the crowd, not for support but for escape. Cameras were everywhere. The officer's hand jerked, his gun no longer pointed with conviction. Adrienne held her ground, silent but unshaken. Others had spoken now, confirming what she had endured. Walter stepped forward, positioning himself between the weapon and his wife. He didn't look for backup. He simply stood where the world needed to see the line between control and collapse. The hallway camera above clicked on. It hadn't caught the beginning, but it now recorded everything that mattered. Walter stood tall. His posture was a statement. The gun, no longer threatening, looked useless, like something forgotten by the man holding it. The officer tried to speak, but stopped when the camera light turned solid green. He knew what that meant. From this point on, every move was evidence. One mistake, and the recording would carry it forever. Walter remained still. The light behind him cast a sharp outline. Who stood to protect, who stood to harm, and who had already lost that right. Adrienne tilted her head slightly, eyes calm as if watching the final move of a match already lost. She didn't need to say anything. The moment spoke for itself, and the camera kept recording. No emotion, no edits, just the truth. A shaking gun, eyes that no longer commanded fear, a step that couldn't retreat, and one man, in uniform, who never raised his voice, yet made the other lower his weapon. The first clip uploaded online lasted just 30 seconds. It opened with a shot of Adrienne standing tall in the parking lot, holding her shopping bag, staring down the barrel of a gun. There was no introduction, No preamble. Everything started with a sharp silence broken only by the wind and distant footsteps. The camera tilted slightly. The person filming held it low but steady enough to capture the entire confrontation. The title attached to the clip was brief. No exclamation point, no clickbait. Just 6 words. He pointed it at the wrong woman. A plain sentence, but it hit like an indictment. It appeared on social media like a cut so sharp you didn't realize you were bleeding until the second watch. The view count climbed by the second. In the comments, early reactions were skeptical, then stunned, and finally furious. But what made the video spread wasn't the shouting or the act of violence. It was the silence. A silence heavy with weight, holding steady at the moment people braced for collapse, but instead witnessed a figure unshaken, and the arrival of someone who shifted the power dynamic long tilted toward the armed. A user edited the video into a slow-motion cut, isolating the 5-second window to replay the moment. First, Adrian's eyes, unflinching, unbowed, aligned directly with the gun. The wind teased her hair, creating an almost surreal image, as if she were not in a parking lot, but in a courtroom yet to seat its judge. The frame then shifted to the gun, still, unmoving, but heavy. The officer's hand trembled slightly, his trigger finger no longer as firm. He held something the whole world was watching, and that world was no longer silent. Finally, Walter's footsteps entered from the right. Just one step, timed perfectly as light from a car window flashed off the badge on his chest. A beam of light sliced across, and his figure came into full view. Upright, composed, steady. The white uniform and gleaming metals needed no enhancement for visual effect. They naturally conveyed the presence of someone who didn't need to be there, but whose arrival meant truth had to fall back into its rightful order. The slow-motion version had nearly no sound, just wind and the soft, mechanical click of the camera. But viewers didn't need audio to understand what was happening. What they saw was a transfer of authority, not through violence, but presence. A man walked in, issued no orders, yet made everyone holding a phone grip it tighter. Someone added a faint caption to the lower corner of the video. There is a difference between silence and presence. No one knew where the line came from, but it fit. It was reposted, quoted, and clipped tens of thousands of times in under an hour. Adrian became a symbol not because she resisted, but because she stood her ground. Walter didn't become a hero by saving someone, but by stepping forward when others had turned away. Their moment together wasn't scripted, wasn't staged, needed no spokesperson. The camera recorded it, and the internet did the rest. From another angle, the original video, unedited, untrimmed, was sent directly to the Internal Affairs Division of the Federal Inspector's Office. The subject line of the email carried no commentary, just one line. Video starts at 0:13. No need to fast forward. And from that second onward, an investigation was launched not because an officer drew a gun, but because a woman didn't look away when he did. The first 3 hashtags began to appear sporadically after 10 minutes of the original clip being shared, but by the 30th minute they had surged straight to the top 5 spots on both of the largest platforms. No one launched a campaign, and there was no need for a media strategy blueprint. The phrases were typed out as reflex. 5 seconds to fall. Black calm power. You should have known. The first phrase, 5 seconds to fall, highlighted that brief moment before the officer hit rock bottom. 5 seconds might have seemed meaningless, but it was the amount of time it took for his loss of control to begin to crack open. Someone wrote succinctly, 5 seconds for him to believe he had power, and then his entire career collapsed in exactly that time. The phrase spread like a new formula for measuring instant justice. Every edited video, capturing the moment Walter stepped in, bore those words across the frame as an irreplaceable title. Black calm power became the chosen term for Adrienne's demeanor, a calm that needed no force. A strength that needed no display. People isolated her face as she stood before the gun's muzzle, centered it on the screen, and ran a caption. She did not resist. She was present. That image appeared across countless accounts, from activists to high school students. A 12-year-old girl wrote, "It's the first time I've seen silence echo this loudly." "You should have known" was not just an exclamation, but a verdict. It was not aimed solely at the officer, but at an entire system that had assumed a black woman in a white suit in a parking lot would be an easy target. The words were printed on shirts, on essay covers, on protest posters that sprang up in several cities. "You should have known" required no explanation. The mistake was too obvious, and if by now someone still did not understand, then that phrase itself was the final condemnation. Beneath a video reposted for the 93rd time, a comment rose to the top within 10 minutes. The account was anonymous, with no photo, but their words made everyone in the comment section pause for a few seconds. "I've replayed it 12 times. The moment he walks in, it feels like justice returns, not with a gun, but with a uniform." That sentence was shared more than 30,000 times within an hour. It did not rally, it did not reduce itself to emojis or symbols, but every word cut to the heart of the matter. Someone dared to step from the shadows, not to strike back, but to represent the integrity that had been neglected for too long. In later public ethics classes, the instructor did not need to replay the footage. Instead, they offered those 3 hashtags and that single comment, then asked students to write what they thought about power, restraint, and being present at the right moment. One wrote, "Justice is not a person in robes striking a gavel. Justice is the one who enters at the right time, keeps his hands steady, and makes the gun on the other side start to tremble." The story of Adrian and Walter went far beyond an isolated incident. It became a rare example of how a quiet act could bring down an entire system of abuse simply by standing in the right place. There was no gunshot, not a drop of blood, but everyone felt something very real had been shot down in those 5 brief seconds. And what fell was not a body, but the illusion of an untouchable kind of power. From then on, whenever the event was mentioned, there was no need for lengthy explanations. People just named those 3 hashtags, and anyone listening would know this was the story of an officer, a woman, a husband, and of a moment when justice needed no gun to be recognized. The press release was issued the following morning, terse and cold enough to make it hard to believe it pertained to an event that was triggering a wave of national outrage. "Officer Park has been temporarily suspended pending an investigation into professional conduct," read the official bulletin from the City Police Department. No apology, no admission of wrongdoing, and not even a mention of the woman who had a gun pointed at her face just a day earlier. The wording was arranged like a jacket meant to cover a wound still fresh, as if the incident were not out of control, but merely a procedural detail requiring further review. The press swarmed outside police headquarters, firing questions about what exactly professional conduct meant, and why the officer from the video had not yet been detained. The spokesperson repeated the same line. The incident was under investigation. The media team tried every strategy to frame it as an internal matter, but the public didn't stay quiet. Clips were reshared, comments pinned, and hashtags remained among the top searches. And the simplest question, why such an action was referred to merely as a matter of professional review, still had no answer. Meanwhile, the one person the media most wanted to hear from remained almost entirely silent. Walter gave no interviews. He did not appear on television. He posted no personal statements. When a credentialed reporter from the Capitol came to the base requesting a brief conversation, Walter responded with a single slip of paper passed through the gate. "I'm not trying to be a hero, I just couldn't stay silent again." 7 words, no more, written in steady, slightly slanted handwriting that suggested he had thought carefully before committing them to paper. It wasn't a denial, nor a politician's humility. It was the clear response of someone who had watched too many wrongs unfold without stepping in soon enough. This time, he had stepped forward, and he needed no praise for doing so. The media tried to frame Walter as a symbol, the soldier defending his family, the ideal husband, the principled officer. But every time someone reached out for a statement, they received the same reply. He did not represent any system, nor did he wish to become the face of what should have been everyone's basic instinct. The Navy's Public Affairs Office was forced to hold a short briefing, clarifying that the incident bore no connection to any official duty and that Walter had acted in a personal capacity. Yet the more they tried to separate him from the event, the more inseparable he became from the moment he stepped into the frame. Because when justice appears, not through authority but through conviction, it refuses to remain in the background. Adrienne declined to speak to the press, but an internal recording from a closed-door meeting at City Hall later surfaced. Her voice was clear, devoid of bitterness, but her final sentence drew the entire room into an unusually long silence. "I don't need anyone to apologize to me. I just want to know, starting now, when a black woman walks out of a supermarket, will people see her as a customer or a suspect?" There was no applause. No one responded, but everyone present understood that they had just heard something no news report could ever capture in writing. It was the kind of truth that made people reconsider behaviors they once accepted as normal, like a random police check, a citizen turning away, a suspicious glance in a parking lot. All those small things, gathered together, created the circumstances for a woman to be forced to stand still in front of a gun and for a man to step forward and break that pattern. Officer Park still had not spoken. His attorney stated that his client was experiencing psychological stress and would fully cooperate with the investigation. But by now, the public was no longer waiting for his answer. The story had moved beyond the scope of one official and one personal mistake. It had become a milestone, and Walter, whether he wanted to or not, had become the marker of that moment, with the very values this system had neglected for too long, intervening at the right time, maintaining dignity in the right place, and remaining silent only when it was time to listen. The suspension of Officer Park did nothing to ease public outrage. On the contrary, pressure from the community, the media, and civil rights organizations forced the city to take an unprecedented step, establishing an independent oversight committee. The structure of this committee was announced publicly in the Tuesday morning news bulletin, consisting of 7 people, 3 civilian representatives, 2 legal advisors from human rights organizations, and 2 senior military officers who had previously served as ethical oversight supervisors in the armed forces. The involvement of the military in a civilian investigation committee was controversial from the outset, but their presence was not to pass judgment, but to ensure one principle only: those who wear badges could not grant each other immunity. It was the Navy itself that proposed the 2 names, one of whom coordinated internal complaints abroad, and the other had written investigative reports on war crimes in Africa. Neither of them was a friend or colleague of Walter, and that made their presence all the more significant. At the first closed meeting, the chairwoman, a lawyer who had once headed a witness protection network, demanded access to all files related to Officer Park, including documents previously classified as for internal use only. She read nearly 400 pages in 3 days, then quietly placed a sheet of A4 paper on the table at the 4th meeting. The first line read, "Officer Park, subject of 3 formal complaints in the past 4 years for aggressive conduct while on duty, all closed due to lack of evidence." No one was surprised, but everyone felt a chill, because all 3 records contained nearly identical phrases, typed by different departments, yet repeating a single reason: lack of credible witnesses. One file stated the complainant was an undocumented immigrant. Another, from a university student, noted that the neighborhood camera malfunctioned at the exact time of the incident. The third file, the most serious, came from a black woman in her 40s, reporting that Park had shoved her to the ground during a random check. In her statement, she wrote clearly, "I did not scream. I just asked why I was being stopped when I had done nothing wrong." None of these files were made public. Not a single case reached the courts. But when Park's actions in the clip with Adrienne were compared, no one needed further proof to realize this was not the first time. The committee requested all internal videos, including archived data from body cameras in the prior complaints. A legal advisor on the committee emphasized, if there have already been 3 previous incidents, then this is not an accident. It is a system that enables wrongdoing. That statement was quoted repeatedly on the news, printed in bold on the front page of a major newspaper, placed beside a blurred image of Park, the man whom the public was beginning to see not as a troubled individual, but as the finished product of a culture of protection. Walter did not take part in any aspect of the investigation. He filed no petitions, sought no favors, but his image, standing between Adrian and Park's gun, was the long shadow over the entire hearing. Each time a committee member reopened an old file, everyone could sense what the entire country had once witnessed. An officer who believed he had absolute power, his fear visible when confronted by a man who entered with nothing but unbreakable conviction. The committee had not yet concluded, but a leaked preliminary report showed they were considering an unprecedented proposal to permanently remove Officer Park from all law enforcement agencies, even in an administrative support role, because if someone who had been warned 3 times could still point a gun at an innocent woman in broad daylight, the question was no longer why did he do it, but who allowed him to do it all these years? And that answer, though late, could not be closed once again this time. The living room was quiet, with only the soft tick of the wall clock marking each passing minute. The yellow glow of the lamp cast warm light over the leather armrest, giving the space the stillness of undisturbed dust. Adrienne sat on the edge of the sofa, hands resting lightly on her knees, eyes fixed not on her husband, but on the small window across the room. Outside, the tree branches swayed in the wind, but inside, nothing broke the silence left by the question that had just been spoken. "You," she began, voice low but firm, "why were you silent that time when they shoved little Marcia onto the curb?" Walter looked up from the folder he'd been reading, his brow furrowed, not from confusion, but from the habit of filing that memory away in the locked drawer of his mind. That evening, 5 years ago, they were walking home together after a church graduation. Marcia was only 14, wearing a white dress, walking a few steps ahead, when 2 white officers stopped her for what they claimed was suspicious loitering. They shoved her to the curb, pinned her shoulder, and searched her bag in plain view. Walter had simply gripped Adrian's hand tighter, said nothing, and stepped nowhere. He stood still, just like dozens of others, and let the moment pass in silence. He closed the folder slowly, then turned to face her. In the dim, warm light, his eyes held a heaviness, not fatigue, but weight. It took him a while to respond, and when he did, his voice was nearly a whisper. "I wasn't the man you know today back then." Adrian turned to look at him, not blinking, not because the answer surprised her, but because the admission was what she had been waiting for. "Back then," Walter continued, "I wore a uniform. I held a rank. But in my head, I was still the young recruit, taught that silence was part of order. Every time I wanted to speak up, I heard that voice. Don't make trouble. You're an officer. You can't be the scandal in your unit." He paused, leaning back in the chair, one arm resting on the edge. His eyes never left hers. "I saw everything. And I stood still, and every day after, when I looked in the mirror, I didn't see the rank or medals. I saw a man who didn't protect a child because he was afraid of losing his job." The words made the room feel even quieter. Adrian inhaled softly, then gave a slight nod. She didn't bring up the incident again. She didn't blame him, but something opened in her gaze, not disappointment, but a new kind of trust, the kind that comes when long-awaited truths are finally voiced. "I don't need a husband who knows how to wield power," she said calmly. "I need a husband who knows when to kneel and shield." Walter nodded gently. "I know. And that night in the parking lot, I thought of Marcia. I thought about what would happen if I didn't move, that it would all happen again, only this time with you. So I stepped forward." There was no dramatic crescendo in that moment. No one cried. But something shifted in the space between them. From now on, not everyone needed to wear armor to be a shield. They just needed the courage to confront the silence they once accepted. A soft noise came from the kitchen as their cat leapt onto a chair, brushing against Adrian's leg. She leaned down to pet it, her gaze no longer drifting. Walter rose and walked to the desk, reopening the folder, but before flipping to the next page, he picked up a pen and wrote a line in the corner of the first sheet. Not for display, not for anyone else to read. Just a line, like a vow that needed no witness. Next time, I won't stay silent. No tears were shed, no hands clasped. Just two grown people sitting a short distance apart on a well-worn couch, under a ceiling light that had seen far more than it ever should. Adrienne turned slightly toward Walter, her voice steady like still water in a glass. Not everyone gets the privilege of fixing things with one big moment, she said, eyes on the ceiling. I don't resent you. I just need you not to turn away this time. The words weren't a confrontation, nor a test. They were a request that needed no explanation, because the listener already understood what was being asked. Walter stayed quiet for a few seconds, then gave a slight nod, not as a signal to her, but as confirmation to himself that he was listening, truly listening. She did not blame him for Marcia, because Adrienne always understood. There are fears planted in the minds of black men from the time they are children. Fear of becoming a target, fear of being accused just for speaking up, fear of breaking the structure programmed to preserve a false calm. But she also knew that once you chose to stand with justice, turning away became the most persistent form of guilt, one that no one else could judge except the silent person's conscience. Neither of them said anything further. Walter sighed, his hand resting on his knee, quietly pulling himself forward as if adjusting his position to steady himself, not to stand up, but to hold firm in the wave of memory crashing back. Because when Adrienne said, "I don't resent you," it did not lift a weight from him. On the contrary, it made him feel the burden of expectation even more. The expectation placed on someone who once stepped back when he should have moved forward. On the other side of the bench, Adrienne leaned her head against the upholstered backrest. She stared at the ceiling, the only place in the room untouched by the past or the echoes of the present. That smooth surface became a temporary refuge, letting each line of thought drift free from the pressure of words. They did not embrace. There were no awkward gestures of comfort. Their closeness now did not come from touch, but from sharing a single steady breath. Each breath Walter took echoed with a history of silence, while Adrienne's was the breath of a woman who had waited too long to need to explain what she deserved. Outside, the sound of cars gradually faded. Darkness settled evenly over every hidden corner of the house, yet inside it was still warm, not from temperature but from the reality of this moment. Not staged, not concealed. Some conversations do not need to end in a solution, but simply need to be spoken to begin a new movement. Walter lifted his head, looking at the same spot on the ceiling as Adrienne, because silence now was not avoidance. It was a kind of commitment words could not fully describe. They did not need to touch to know they stood on the right side. And if tomorrow something needs to change, it will not come from an outburst of anger, but from the very silence passing between them now, when both know neither will turn away again. At the first session of the hearing committee, the room was simply arranged. A long table centered beneath low-hanging white lights with nameplates for each member. The public seating area had only 18 chairs, but they were filled early. No TV cameras, no professional equipment, just pens and eyes. And amid them all, Walter Jefferson entered. As if this were the second battlefield he had no choice but to stand on. He wore full military dress, belt tightened, shoes polished to a mirror shine, cap in hand, placed gently on the seat. But when he stood to speak, his first words took everyone by surprise. "My name is Walter Jefferson. I do not represent the military. I represent the role of a husband." There was no strain in his voice. It was even, firm, and weighted, not with rank, but with lived experience. No one had asked him to clarify in what capacity he spoke, but Walter defined the boundary himself, to remind everyone that some truths don't require authority to be valid. His role as a husband was the only reason he stood here today, not to demand vague justice, but to name the individual who had once pointed a gun at his wife's face for the crime of standing with the wrong skin color in a parking lot. Park sat only a few meters away in the chair reserved for the accused. He wore a white shirt and pale gray tie, no longer the gleaming blue uniform from that day. The overhead light washed his face pale, but no one looked at his skin. They looked at his eyes. They weren't teary nor evasive. Park kept his head down as Walter spoke, but the glance he lifted revealed everything. No remorse, only self-preservation. A committee member asked, "Do you have anything to say before we review the file on the 3 prior complaints?" Park clenched his fists, his shoulders slightly hunched. "I followed protocol. That woman, her behavior was suspicious." The words came quickly, clearly rehearsed. But just a second later, the officer managing the records responded directly. "Are you saying walking out of a supermarket with groceries and professional attire is suspicious behavior?" Park gave no reply. His lowered head was no longer to avoid confrontation, but to escape further exposure. Yet, no matter how far he bowed, the truth had already been broadcast onto legal office screens. The scene where he pointed the gun, where he smirked, where his hand didn't shake until Walters stepped into frame. Adrienne wasn't present. She had refused to attend, not out of fear, but because she knew her expression that day had said enough. She was not a victim. She was a moral test for the entire system, and today, Walter was bringing that test back to the table. "I'm not here to shame anyone," Walter said, his voice lower now, "but I cannot let a man who pointed a gun at my wife continue walking the streets with the power to detain anyone." A human rights lawyer on the panel gave a slight nod. No lengthy arguments were needed. That sentence alone made clear this was no longer a personal dispute between 2 individuals. It was a referendum on the public's trust in those sworn to protect them. The hearing did not end with applause. No one honored Walter, but everyone understood that his presence today was not about heroism. It was a reminder of something deceptively simple. Honor does not reside in a uniform. It lies in the moment you choose to step forward when you witness wrongdoing, not because of your role, but because you are human. And once you step forward for what is right, the bowed eyes across from you will never rise again without shame. A final question pierced the room with an unusual silence. A delegate, an older woman, gray-streaked hair, voice slow but sharp, looked straight at Walter without blinking. "So what would you have done," she asked, "if she hadn't turned back to look at you that day?" A question that seemed simple, but carried more than one assumption. It was not only about the events of that day, but dug deeper into the mindset of a man who had stepped forward from behind, with eyes like a blade cutting straight through the self-satisfaction of the man holding the gun. Walter was silent for a few seconds. His eyes did not blink. His hands lay flat on the table, as straight as the uniform on his back. Then he answered. He did not lower his voice, nor raise it. His tone was steady and firm, as if every word had been written in his heart for a long time. "Then today you would be reading my obituary, not my incident report." His reply carried no expression, but the room immediately felt heavier, as if someone had closed the door to a chamber of memories. One sentence, but with the weight of a verdict. It was not directed at the officer in front of him, but at the entire system that had believed skin color was the only factor in determining someone's danger. No one on the committee interrupted after that. The female delegate nodded lightly, then looked down at her papers. She did not ask further, because she understood. Sometimes a brief answer reveals more of the truth than 100 pages of testimony. Park still kept his head down, but for a moment, just a flicker, he looked up and glanced at Walter. That gaze no longer held arrogance. It was tinged with doubt, as if he was no longer sure whether the other man was truly willing to make such a sacrifice. But when he looked into Walter's eyes, steady as a wall, any doubts quietly disappeared. Another man on the committee, a retired senior officer, folded his arms across his chest, murmuring just loudly enough to be heard, "Just one turn of the head, and everything changes." People often talk about courage as if it is a dramatic moment, with shouts and heroic acts, but the moment Walter described was very quiet. A woman turned her head, a man stepped forward. There was no gunfire, no scenes of fighting back. Only the right action is done at the right moment. And if it had not been for that glance, if Adrienne had not turned, if she had not known someone was approaching, then perhaps blood would have been spilled, and Walter might only have been remembered through a viral clip tagged "Gone for Love." The essence of the answer was neither a threat nor an embellishment. It was an admission. Someone like Walter in that situation had no other choice but to step forward. And if that meant sacrifice, then he accepted it. That was not the spirit of the military. It was the instinct of a husband who had stood still for far too long. A young member of the council, perhaps the newest, placed a hand over his heart, as if to remember what he had just heard. Not everyone has lived through a battlefield, but everyone has someone they cannot bear to lose to silence. And that sentence from Walter, on that day, reached far beyond the boundaries of a hearing. It became a warning to anyone who thought power could be abused without consequence. Because if one man is willing to risk his life to stop a gun pointed wrongly at the person he loves, then there will be an entire society behind him willing to remember every detail. And on that day, Walter Jefferson left behind such a sentence. Her words came slowly, each one clear, as if Adrian wasn't giving a statement but laying down a declaration. There was no trembling, no bitterness, only a cadence sharpened by years of restrained silence, a voice that caused the entire courtroom to pause. "I don't want to destroy anyone's career," she said, looking directly at the highest-ranking official in the room. "I want this system to stop destroying innocent people." No one spoke immediately afterward. Even the rustling of the clerk's papers ceased. All eyes turned toward the woman standing between two rows of seats, in a crisp white dress, hair neatly pinned up, not shouting, not theatrical. And precisely because of that, Adrienne's words struck the room like a clean blow. Not by force, but by precision. The judge, a white man in his 60s, with evenly silvered hair and black robes hanging over his hands, had been flipping through files attentively. But after hearing that, he set down his gavel, leaned back in his chair, and kept his eyes fixed on the woman before him. He didn't bang the gavel, didn't interrupt her. He simply sat there, as if reassessing the very concept of justice just voiced by the person who was supposed to be the central victim. There was no applause in the courtroom. This wasn't a stage. But the way the lawyers looked at one another, the way a few reporters gripped their pens tightly, and the way Walter kept his eyes on his wife showed that something had just shifted, not toward anger, but toward unwavering clarity. Adrienne offered no evidence. She didn't recount additional details of the incident, didn't describe the gun pressed to her face, the humiliating gaze, or the trembling that followed. She came here to say one thing. If everyone focused solely on punishing a single individual and ignored the system that bred such behavior, then this hearing would turn into a play with a predictable script. The judge didn't cut her off, as he had done with other overextended statements. Instead, he held his gavel, stared at her for a long moment, then nodded, not politely to move along, but as if acknowledging that something inside him had just been shaken. "Enter it into the record," he said after a moment, his voice low but steady. "Mrs. Rowe's statement will be stored in full. We will take it under consideration." Walter did not step forward to take his wife's hand. He didn't need to. Between them was not a gesture, but an invisible thread, tightened ever since Adrienne's name was entered into the record as a person threatened by law enforcement. The legal representatives, whether present or appearing by screen, had no rebuttal, because her words didn't aim to accuse. They didn't construct a villain to tear down. They simply pointed at the truth everyone in that room already knew, but few were composed enough to speak. The fault didn't lie with one man, but with the principles that allowed him to operate unchecked for so long. After that day's session, when the press quoted Adrienne's speech, many people shared it with a caption that read, "She didn't ask for punishment, she asked for accountability." The phrasing varied, but the distance between those two ideas was exactly what made people in power feel uneasy. Not because she demanded something too large, but because she asked for something everyone knew was right, yet feared to admit, because it struck too close to a kind of morality that had long been asleep. And that day, Adrienne did not apologize for surviving. She did not shrink back to soothe anyone, either. She stood there, in the straight light of the courtroom ceiling, turning herself into a mirror, not to reflect Park's guilt, but to shine straight into the silence that had nurtured him all these years. Park gripped the table, his nails digging into the soft skin below each knuckle. He looked up, his breath coming in quick bursts, his throat straining each word as if he had to force his resentment through a fence of rotted pride. His voice did not sound like justification, but like one last desperate scratch at the walls collapsing around him. "You planned everything," he said, his eyes fixed on Adrienne as if searching for a final scapegoat in the only person who had done nothing. "You wanted me destroyed. This whole thing is a trap." The room did not react. No one spoke up. Because what Park said was not shocking. It was simply the usual flailing of someone used to power, forced to face the consequences of his actions. Adrienne still stood tall, her hand resting lightly on the back of the chair in front. She did not step back nor forward, but her reply made the air sink a shade deeper. "No," she said, her eyes never leaving the face of the man who had once aimed a gun at her forehead. "I just stood still. You were the one who pulled the trigger." Each word she spoke needed no emphasis, no sign of satisfaction, no hint of triumph. That was precisely why her answer cut through every attempt of Park's to play the victim. A minute-taker looked up, hand pausing above the keyboard, as if needing a second to capture each word perfectly. The whole room felt the undercurrent in those words. It was not just for Park. It was for anyone who had ever looked at a black woman and mistaken her silence for weakness. She did not scream, did not rush to tear off the mask of the wrongdoer. She simply let the truth arrive at its own time, at its rhythm, and set it before the entire system as an irrefutable piece of evidence. Park opened his mouth to speak again, but no words carried enough weight to deny something so brutally simple. There was no trap. He was the one who pulled the trigger, not just once, but for years, through tolerated behavior, careless words on late-night shifts, and cold eyes folding up and ignoring every complaint. Walter sat below, fists clenched on his knees. He did not interfere. He did not need to know. Adrienne's answer was as precise as a command, and he knew his role was no longer to shield, but to step back and let her stand in the light. A committee member, silent since the start, gently pulled the microphone toward himself. He was a former chief judge who had participated in 3 investigations into abuse of power, but had never witnessed a hearing where the heaviest truth was wrapped in a single sentence. He nodded toward Adrienne. "I think," he said slowly, "we have heard enough." That sentence did not merely mark the end of a session. It was a milestone, a rare moment in a courtroom when the person with the least power was the one to put a full stop to wrongdoing the system had long turned away from. Park leaned back, his eyes now emptied, no longer hard but hollow. Perhaps for the first time in his career as a police officer, he had to face consequences he could not trample or push aside with authority or a weapon. Because this time, the consequences did not come from anyone else. They came from his actions and from a woman who chose to stand still, but stood in the right place at the right time, and with the dignity of a person who would not bow her head. That day, justice did not raise a fist. It simply told the truth, and sometimes, as Adrienne did, speaking the truth in a room of power is the clearest way to make the guilty lower their heads, not with shouts, but with consequences that cannot be shaken off. The sentence was delivered in a room as still as stone. The judge's voice came steady, clear, without emphasis, without hesitation. 30 years in federal prison. 1 second later, the clapping began. 1 beat at a time, not loud, not furious, but heavy like judgment drums echoing through the soul. The hands did not chant slogans, no one stood up, no one shouted words like justice or victory, they just sat and clapped, rhythmically, resonating like a cleansing sound, as if each strike into the air was a reminder. This should have ended long ago. Park sat motionless, his eyes blank, fixed on the void in front of him. He did not scream, did not protest. His silence was no longer defiance, but the clearest sign of someone who finally understood the game was over. No back doors, no allies in the shadows, no system left strong enough to shield him. Every path had closed the moment he pointed a gun at the forehead of someone who held nothing but honor and dignity. Adrienne did not turn to look at Park. She did not react when the sentence was read. Her eyes blinked once, then rested on Walter's hand, gently curled. No words needed to be exchanged. The answer had lived in the long days before this, days where they didn't need to prove anything, only stand upright long enough for the system to adjust itself to their presence. Walter gave a small nod, his gaze sweeping across the room. There were everyday citizens. There were former service members. There were a few high school students attending on a civic field trip. They were not family members of the victim, but today they were all witnesses, not to a crime, but to a shift once thought impossible. At the back, a middle-aged woman with graying hair clapped, not too loudly but steadily. Her shirt bore the symbol of a local watchdog group, but today she wasn't there on behalf of any organization. She stood as a mother, a citizen, and someone who knew what it felt like to be dismissed because of her skin color. Her clapping lasted more than a minute. When it stopped, no one shouted victory. No fists were raised, because here, justice wasn't something to celebrate. It was something that should have always been present. Park was escorted from the courtroom in silence. No loud boots, no clinking cuffs. He moved down the courthouse hallway like a shadow, swallowed between two officers. This time men who didn't joke, didn't smirk. They weren't there to protect him. They were there to take him to the place he should have been a long time ago. The judge glanced at the final document on his desk, gave a slight nod, and stood up. He offered no further remarks. A verdict was delivered that no explanation was needed, and as he stepped down from the bench, everyone remained in their seats, as if waiting for one more breath to close what had just happened. Adrienne rose slowly. Walter walked to her side but did not touch her shoulder. They did not need a gesture of affirmation. Everything that needed saying had already been said, not in words, but in the actions of the past several days. At the exit, a black child tugged at his mother's hand, whispering, "Mom, did she win?" The mother shook her head softly, then bent down and murmured, "No, sweetheart. She just reminded the whole country that some people have to stand tall for a very long time before they are finally called by the right name." As Park was led out of the courtroom, his steps felt as heavy as if he were dragging behind him every page of the false reports he had never before faced. The two security officers at his side did not say a word. They only did their duty, but the way they kept their distance, their eyes never meeting his, silently confirmed. From now on, he no longer belonged to what people called the force that protects. Just as he was about to cross the final threshold, a woman's voice rose from the gallery. It was not an insult, nor the instinctive shout of anger. It was a choked cry from a mother's throat. "You are the reason my child fears the police." The entire room seemed to fall an octave. No one had noticed the woman before. She sat in the third row, gray hair hanging over half her face, but when she stood up clutching a small photo of a child, everyone understood. This was This was an indirect witness, someone who had lived in the shadows cast by Park and those like him. Park turned his head, not to face her, but as a reflex. He tried to say something, but nothing came out. Maybe he knew any words now would only further prove one thing, that fear was real, not because she had invented it, but because he had planted it. That mother did not cry. She only gripped her son's photo tighter, then sat down, her head bowed as if a burden no one had ever named had just been released. No one came to her, but the whole room was silent, and in that silence, a different kind of justice was being done, not by the court, but by those who had borne the harm. In the last row, Adrienne quietly stood up. She needed no attention, no camera pointed her way. Her white dress was still perfectly pressed. Her flat shoes made a soft sound on the cold tiles. She did not move to the front, did not approach Park. She simply turned, took a folded piece of paper from her pocket. No one knew what she had written, but before leaving her seat, She bowed slightly and placed the note on the very chair where she had sat through the entire hearing. "This is justice, not hatred." Her voice was not loud, not emphatic, but every person in the room heard it, because there was nothing left to say. Each word seeped into the air as a final reminder, not for Park, but for the whole system now standing at the edge of renewal. Walter stood a few steps away, eyes fixed on his wife. He did not ask what she had written, nor did he need to know. He understood. Here, amid anger and legal response, Adrienne chose to leave the only thing that could guide what came next, a clear definition of justice, untouched by blood. The court clerk walked over slowly afterward. When she saw the note, she paused, glanced at the judge, then gently picked it up. She did not open it. She just laid her hand on the paper, as if holding on to the warmth of an action deeply human and deeply powerful. A few students in the legal education group craned their necks for a better look. A young brown-skinned child quietly asked the teacher beside him, "Did she write that for him?" The teacher smiled, shaking her head. "She wrote it for everyone who ever sits in that chair in the future." And so, with no flowers, no slogans, no further speeches, Adrienne left the courtroom. She walked out the way she had entered, carrying no burden of hatred, but leaving in everyone a faint tightening in the chest. No one saw her as a victim anymore. They saw her as the one who made a whole court stand still and listen to what should have been heard from the very beginning, that justice cannot come from a gun, much less from hatred, but only from doing what is right at the hardest moment. After the trial, once the crowd had dispersed and the media spotlight no longer shone on the front doors, Park was led out through a back corridor. Gray brick walls, no nameplates, no directional signs. There were no cameras, no reporters, no applause. Just a dim hallway reserved for those who no longer had a reason to leave through the main entrance. The two escorting officers kept a professional distance, showing no visible emotion. Park kept his head down, his steps slower than usual, not because his hands were tied, but because each step had lost the weight of authority. Each echoing footfall rebounded from the past. The strides he once took through police station hallways, the smirk as he dismissed complaints, the cold glance he gave vulnerable civilians. Now, all of it returned with each step, unchanged, unfiltered. But Park didn't yet know this silent path wasn't the end. When the metal door to the parking lot opened, he saw a woman standing there. She wore no badge, held no sign, only a faded photograph in her hands. The image showed a young black man with gentle eyes, wearing a white shirt, a faint scar on his neck that would be easy to miss. The mother didn't yell. She didn't thrust the photo toward Park like an accusation. She just stood there, silent. The evening breeze rustled her clothing, but her hands holding the frame didn't tremble. Her face showed no tears, no contorted rage, only her eyes, direct, deep, and still, as if waiting for this moment for 10 years. Park froze for a second. He recognized the picture. He remembered those eyes. He had seen them once, in a case closed with the line, "Cause of death undetermined." That young man had once asked him during a street ID check, "What did I do wrong, officer?" Park didn't answer. He just shoved the man onto the car hood. No one recorded it. No witnesses came forward. Later, the death was ruled an accident. Now, the mother stood before him like the embodiment of an untried past. Park looked down. He wanted to walk away, but the officers didn't move. No one forced him to face her, but no one allowed him to escape either. At that moment, Walter appeared at the edge of the stone steps across the courtyard. His eyes locked on Park, not with fiery rage, but with something quieter, more enduring, harder to erase. A refusal to forgive that needed no words. When Park turned away to step into the car, Walter remained unblinking. And in that moment when their eyes met, something unspoken settled. The one who once instilled fear could never expect forgiveness from those who had lived through it. In that courthouse yard, under a sky without spotlights, there were only 3 figures: a man exposed, a husband still carrying the pain, and a mother representing the hundreds who had buried sons without ever learning the name behind the gun. The engine started, The door shut. The mother didn't move. Walter stayed where he was until the taillights vanished behind the concrete wall, and when he turned away, his right hand clenched, not to strike, but to remember the face, the eyes, and the very moment when justice needed no punch to exist. She returned home in the late afternoon, just as the sun dipped behind the trees across the street, casting its final light against the window pane. The house was as quiet as usual. Walter was dusting the frame of a service medal near the entrance, his head slightly tilted, eyes focused. He didn't ask about the closed-door meeting that morning, nor mention the flood of headlines bearing her name. Adrienne set her purse on the table, removed her earrings, and then reached for her phone to check missed calls. The screen showed a hidden message. "Next time, you won't be so lucky." The message was cold, a single sentence sent in the quiet between breaths. It was not an open threat or a blatant crime, just a note whose words stung like venom. It felt as if someone was always watching, waiting for the day Walter would not be there, or for witnesses to disappear. Adrienne said nothing. She turned on airplane mode, set her phone down, poured a glass of water, and sat facing the window. This was not hiding, it was her boundary. She would not let hateful words cross the threshold of her home. An hour later, the doorbell rang. Walter checked the security camera and opened the door. On the doorstep was an unmarked brown envelope. "Postmarked 3 days ago," he said, handing it to Adrienne. Inside, she found a folded letter. "Thank you for standing up for those who are gone. I have never met you or your husband, but I once stood where you stood. I did not get to come home. I write to say, that day, you made everyone rethink who justice belongs to." At the bottom, Marcia, 2011. Adrienne folded the letter, holding it in her palm as if feeling a heartbeat from the past. Walter did not ask who Marcia was. He remembered the name from a story Adrienne once told about a black girl shot in Georgia. "Maybe her mother," Adrienne whispered, and Walter nodded. The letter stayed on the coffee table, visible, not hidden away. Anyone visiting would see it and understand. The one who wrote the letter was no longer invisible, and Adrienne had turned a threat into the first stone of a lasting memory. Proof that real justice needs witnesses who will not be silent. At a police training center more than 50 miles from the city, tucked among beige-walled buildings, sun-stained and quietly aging, a new course was quietly launched. There was no press release, no ceremonial opening, and no mention of names like Adrienne Park or even the city where the incident happened. On a neutral-looking digital board, the course title appeared without fanfare: Impulse Control in Racially Charged Encounters. It was presented as a routine reform, wrapped in procedural updates and framed as a step toward better community service. But everyone sitting in that room, from rookies just out of probation to middle-aged officers undergoing recertification, knew the real reason they were here wasn't in the yearly plan. The classroom was arranged in a wide semicircle, the lectern positioned low, with no hierarchy in sight. The instructor, an Asian American man once part of an internal oversight commission, wore no uniform and didn't introduce himself with ranks. When the course began, he simply projected a single sentence on the screen behind him: "No one threatens you just by standing still." The room held its breath. A few shifted in their chairs. A young officer furrowed his brows, as if searching for subtext. A seasoned sergeant crossed his arms, offering a half-smirk, but said nothing. And in that shared silence, the weight of the words settled. The instructor then spoke, his tone quiet but firm. "I don't want you to remember the incident. I want you to remember that moment. A gun drawn without any valid threat. Because if your reflex is rooted in prejudice, then that reflex is the crack that leads to a 30-year sentence." One officer raised a hand. "We're trained to react fast. There's no time to analyze." The instructor nodded, not arguing. "That's why what's inside you is the only thing you can clean before you go out there. If a black woman in a clean white suit triggers a threat in your head, the problem isn't your response speed. The problem is the lens you're reacting through. Another trainee, speaking more softly, asked, "Are we being blamed if someone stands still and we misread it?" The instructor stepped off the platform and walked into the seats. You can misread, but misreading with your finger on the trigger is a choice. Doubt is human. Doubt with a loaded weapon is a decision. And that decision, once made, doesn't just stay with you. It changes someone else's life. At the end of the session, written surveys asked one final question. When you're under pressure, what image flashes in your mind first? Someone holding a knife or someone with unfamiliar skin? The name Adrienne never appeared in the lesson. Neither did Park. But as the trainees exited the room and walked toward the parking lot, some slowed down when passing an older black janitor sweeping near the entrance. They didn't nod, they didn't look away, they just looked, fully, quietly, and, for the first time, not through a protocol, but through presence. Inside the admin office, the instructor powered down his laptop, printed one sentence, and pinned it to the shared bulletin board between schedules and supply forms. It was the same line from the start, but now, in that space where policy met memory, it read differently, like a quiet command etched by everything left unsaid. No one threatens you just by standing still. And beneath it, in red ink, he added a smaller line, "But you can destroy your honor if you do not learn to stand still before you judge." A hand was raised from the fourth row, the voice of a new trainee, still carrying a hint of youth. Not exactly challenging, but filled with doubt. "What if I do not draw my gun and get attacked? We are taught to protect ourselves first." That question made a few heads turn. Some eyes dropped, while others seemed to wait to see how the instructor would answer. But he was neither angry nor judgmental. He simply took a step toward the trainee, hands clasped behind his back, and replied in a tone hard to define. "If you do not discriminate, you might not be attacked. Most conflicts do not begin with actions, they start with a look. If your eyes already carry fear of a group, your reactions will never be fair." A moment of silence settled over the class. Like dust gathering on an old metal, his voice continued, slower, as if wanting to engrave each word into the minds before him. "Remember this: a person standing still, not raising their hands, not cursing, not armed, has never been a threat to a fully armed officer. The threat only appears when your mind creates it because of skin color, manner, or prejudices planted long before you put on the uniform." At the back of the room, near the filing cabinet, was a small photo board. No name, no caption, no decoration. A single photo was posted against the white background. A black woman in a white suit, a string of pearls tied around her neck. Both hands slightly raised, but her gaze steady. There was no context, no weapon, no tears, no pleading expression, only a look that made anyone feel exposed when facing it. One member of the class walked toward it. He was not someone easily moved. His shoulder still bore scars from his first internship, his manner firm, the way many young people in the field try to be. But this time he did not act tough. He stepped forward, stopped in front of the photo, and placed a hand gently on the lower edge of the frame. No one told him to. There was no rule requiring interaction with that picture, but he did so. A reflex acknowledging he was facing something that had once been dismissed. Across the room, the instructor watched, but said nothing more. He allowed the room to settle into its most natural state. No slogans, no lesson, reduced to 3 lines. Just a moment when a young person laid a hand on the image of a woman who nearly lost her life because someone decided her stillness was reason enough to ready a weapon. In the middle of the room, slanted sunlight from the window fell across the empty seats, quietly casting the photo's shadow on the desk ahead. Silent, nameless image, but enough for those in uniform to realize, sometimes, the greatest lesson is not in how quickly you draw your weapon, but in how long you dare to keep it holstered, long enough to see who is truly standing before you. A young nurse appeared in a short clip filmed shortly after the hearing. Her voice was neither trembling nor forceful, but each word cut clearly into the listener's perception. She didn't speak up to become a symbol, but because of her, I'm no longer afraid to say, "You're wrong." She recalled her first time working in the emergency room when a male officer pointed and barked orders without reason. She slowly removed her gloves, stood tall, and asked, Under what authority? The words didn't echo like a slogan, but they made the man pause. For the first time, he saw a black woman who neither flinched nor backed down. The nurse said that, in that moment, she pictured Adrian in a white suit, not from a photograph, but from the eyes in the video, etched into a generation's memory. At the same time, at a small suburban train station, a high school student was stopped by two officers for looking suspicious. He wore a backpack and a school uniform, nothing remarkable except for his brown skin and direct gaze. When one officer reached for his weapon, the boy pulled out his phone and started recording. He didn't tremble or shout. The clip lasted 2 minutes. He barely spoke, only stood still, maintaining the same gaze seen in the clip shared by the entire community. When asked why he did it, he said, "I knew I had no gun. I just had eyes like hers." Two small stories. Two people who never met, but both shared the same posture, standing still, not in the name of something grand, but simply refusing to be humiliated again. Their actions didn't make them heroes, but they helped others understand that justice sometimes begins with staying upright, even when unprotected. And so, Adrian's story, though never aired on television, spread in a way no system could contain, through gazes passed from person to person, through silences that no longer meant submission, but marked the start of a new kind of defiance. Among thousands of videos and countless comments, no one called her a victim. They called her the reason. And that reason didn't come from force or demands, but from the fact that she didn't step back, even with a gun at her face. In her, people saw something generations of black women had lost: the right to stand tall before a threat, the right not to become an apology for something they never did wrong. Now, even though Adrienne no longer appears, refusing interviews and skipping public events, scattered acts continue to recall that moment. A woman in a white suit, standing still, unwavering eyes, shaking an entire system. She no longer needs to speak because others have learned to speak for her, not with rage, but with stance, not with slogans, but by refusing to bow. A social media account with a plain white dot on a black background gained attention weeks after the trial. No real name, no clear profile picture. The person behind it introduced themselves with a single line: "I once had a gun to my head, and I stood still." The first post, titled "Silent Resistors," didn't romanticize pain or glorify suffering, but aimed to restore dignity to those who chose not to kneel. Each entry was a real story, submitted by followers. No dramatic language, no overdrawn setups, just blunt reports. Sometimes just a few lines. "I was stopped for walking fast in a white neighborhood. I stood still, didn't resist, didn't argue. When they searched my bag and found nothing, I simply asked, 'Can I walk now?'" Over time, people stopped sharing the old clip. That story did not need to go viral again. It had moved beyond the cycle of trends to become an instinct in daily life. A mother pulled her child close at the sight of injustice and said, "Look carefully, do not turn away." A teacher changed the final assignment to "Someone who taught you about dignity through silent action." A student in criminal law class analyzed a scenario on self-defense by presence. No one mentioned Adrienne Rowe's name anymore. Not out of forgetfulness, but because her name no longer belonged to just one person. It had become a foundation for others to stand on, not to replace, but to continue. She no longer needed to appear, because she was present in the way people moved through crowded streets, kept their gaze steady even when questioned unfairly, or paused for half a second to see if someone was being insulted without a witness. This was not the reach of media, but the rooting of a lesson in social behavior. It was not easily measured by shares or followers, but was clear in this: those who once bowed their heads now looked up, not for revenge, but to remind those behind them that there is another way to live, even when a gun is pointed at your forehead. And that story, in its quiet way, changed not just how people thought, but how they walked through a world long used to being ruled by shouts. Alter received the internal summons from the Navy on a quiet Tuesday. The envelope was plain, but the bold text inside was clear. Investigation into off-duty officer conduct involving a firearm. He read through over 10 pages, then paused. Without hesitation, he wrote 2 lines. I chose to stand between the gun and my wife. I would do it again. For him, that wasn't a defense, it was a fact. When he submitted the report, the clerk paused, unsure if it was defiant. Walter nodded once and left without waiting for acknowledgement. A week later, the internal board met behind closed doors. In a stark white room, they asked him to recount the event, provide evidence, and explain why he hadn't informed a superior first. Walter answered steadily, I wasn't trained to leave family behind when threatened at gunpoint. A senior advisor asked, if she'd walked away, would things be different? Walter replied, yes. But she didn't. That's why I didn't. The hearing lasted over 4 hours. The final report included 3 sentences from Walter and 2 outcomes: no disciplinary action and a call to review off-duty response policies involving civilians and race. No applause followed, but something shifted. A few closed their eyes longer than usual. Others held in words they couldn't say. Driving back, Walter stopped at a base where he once trained cadets. At the bulletin board, he removed an old notice and pinned a blank sheet. He wrote, when facing what is wrong, choose to stand for what's right, even if it's not permitted. In the days that followed, trainers pointed to that line and told recruits, this isn't in the manual, but it defines you. Walter didn't want to be a symbol. He just hoped that someday someone else faced with the same choice would remember that once a man stood without needing to speak. A week later, an inquiry was opened into his former commander, Edward Monroe, who had dismissed a case involving a black teen beaten by Park. Walter had once flagged the hallway video. Monroe ignored it. But with Park now on trial, that file resurfaced, and this time there was no erasing it. An independent audit group was brought in to review every report Monroe had signed in connection with Park. 2 other cases with suspicious signs of violent conduct shared the same pattern. The files were closed within 3 days. There was never a third-party witness, and the victims lacked the resources to pursue a complaint. In a small internal meeting at headquarters, Monroe sat at the end of the table, his hand shaking slightly as he signed the leave decision pending investigation. No one saw him off. Only a memo was sent afterward to all officers. Even if you do not use force, if you are complicit by staying silent, the system will treat you as guilty. That same day, in the main cafeteria of the naval headquarters, Walter ate lunch as usual, his officer's cap placed neatly beside his tray. A group of young officers passed by, the last one in line pausing for a moment. It was Lieutenant Colonel Melissa Rowe, head of emergency response training, and one of the few women of color ever to hold a senior position in the area. She did not look at him with pity or admiration. She simply stopped, leaning close enough for her words not to carry beyond the space between them. You may not be promoted any further. Her voice was neither sad nor comforting, but you just kept something more important than rank. Walter set his fork down and turned to her, his look unsurprised. Melissa understood immediately that his nod was not for gratitude, but to confirm he knew the price he had just paid. An officer caught between civilians and uniforms, between personal dignity and organizational structure, could not always choose the right side and keep his standing. Back at his office, Walter opened the military's automated promotion tracker. His name was still there, but had been moved off the year's priority list. A small line below noted, "Review after periodic oversight is complete." He did not turn off the screen right away. He let that line glow for a few minutes, as if letting it speak the rest on its own. A little later, Adrienne called. She did not ask about the meeting or mention promotions. She only shared that a 9th-grade girl in the school district had written a letter asking permission to organize a talk about the right kind of silence and the right to stand tall. Their story had quietly entered the curriculum, with no need for declarations. Walter looked out the window, sunlight streaming across the wooden desk. Next to his nameplate was a slip of paper someone had left. "You do not need to climb higher if you have chosen to stand firm." He did not know who wrote it, but he folded it, slipped it into his inner pocket, like one keeps an ID, for whenever proof of identity is needed, Behind the quiet grounds of the Federal Security Academy stood a newly built brick wall, unpolished red, waist-high, with no plaque, no sign, and no official insignia. It sat alone in the open yard, partially hidden behind low trees, far from the busy training quarters. Strangely, every first-year cadet passing by was required to stop for exactly 5 seconds and place a hand on it. No one explained why. Some did it hastily, treating it as routine. Others paused longer before moving on. But no one ever refused. An instructor, when asked about this odd ritual, answered simply, "If you can't stand still for 5 seconds in front of a wall, no one can trust you to stay calm in front of an innocent person." Then he walked off without turning back. Over time, the wall became routine. No one named it. No one labeled it. And precisely because of that anonymity, it became the only spot on campus where rank meant nothing. Veteran officers and recruits alike stood the same, hand on brick, eyes forward. On a fall afternoon, during a scheduled unarmed interaction drill, a group of trainees walked through the yard. When they reached the wall, the lead cadet slowed down and stopped. One placed a hand, then another. No one spoke. Only breath, the crunch of dry leaves and the cool surface of brick, like the skin of something that had witnessed too much. Some closed their eyes. Some looked straight through it, searching beyond theory. One tall, sun-darkened trainee arrived last. He did not rush. As his hand touched the brick, his shoulders trembled. Someone asked quietly, "What do you see?" He replied, "It's not seeing, it's remembering." He said nothing more. No one asked again. Soon after, handwritten letters appeared in the Academy's suggestion box, each reflecting on the moment of contact with the wall. None were signed, yet all shared the same strange feeling: tingling fingertips, the sensation of being watched from the other side, and a quiet thought, if it had been me that day, would I have stood still? The board did not reply. They only added a sanitizer stand beside the wall for cadets to clean their hands after the ritual. Still, no one explained. In the weeks that followed, older instructors began to slow down when passing the wall. Some touched it, some didn't, but all glanced back, if only for a second. No cameras, no reports. Just a nameless wall that quietly became part of a moral test, one that every cadet knew. If you pull a gun on the wrong person, no apology will be enough. But if you learn how to stand still at the right moment, maybe the system won't need another victim. One foggy winter morning, a young cadet stood before the wall for the first time. No one had told him its story, but today was his turn. He didn't speak, he didn't ask. And as his hand met the cold, rough brick, something stirred beneath his skin. Not from the weather, but from a buried memory of a lecture on how to control your reflex when race enters the frame. A voice called from behind, "Who does this wall commemorate?" The question came from another trainee, his age, eyes bold, almost mocking. No one answered until a female officer walking by paused and replied evenly, "No one." Sometimes people stand still and still have a gun pointed at them. That was enough. No more questions followed. There were no plaques or candles on the wall, no ceremonies, but in veteran instructors' notebooks, a note was taped to the back cover. If someone pauses for 5 seconds, maybe next time they will not pull the trigger. The line was never on slides or in lessons, but when a trainee rushed past or dismissed the wall, an instructor would quietly let them read it and then close the book. One day, law students toured the academy. Most walked past the wall without a glance, but one black woman paused, touched the bricks, and asked, "What case is this wall from?" The guide replied, "No specific case, but one video changed everything." She said no more, but told her friend, "If I ever see someone stand tall while a gun is pointed at them, I'll remember this wall." Classes came and went. Those who touched the wall remembered those 5 seconds. Sometimes, as a rule, as a reminder. If a woman could be targeted for standing still with a calm gaze, the least they could do was hesitate before aiming at the next person like her. The wall stayed, needing no protection. Everyone who touched it understood it was harder to break the silence it represented than to break bricks. In some end-of-term reflections, a trainee wrote, "If every officer paused 5 seconds before pulling the trigger, maybe that would be enough to remember justice does not start with a gun." That line was filed away, becoming another memory in the wall's silent legacy. Under the hallway's dim yellow light, a young officer paused. The graduation ceremony had ended, with laughter and promises in the air, but he didn't follow the others. Instead, he looked toward the brick wall behind the academy, then opened his file and signed his resignation. His note said only, "I'm not afraid of the enemy. I'm afraid of becoming Park." Without realizing it, he couldn't accept a future where his gaze might see a person as a threat, not a light. The training officer said nothing, just took the letter. Few walk away out of fear of doing wrong. Most stay to protect their image. A week later, he left the city without a trace, but his name remained in a handwritten note by a female instructor, one who stepped back before becoming what he once judged. His departure didn't make headlines, but it marked a quiet refusal to cross a line he still recognized. Far away, Adrienne lived quietly, no interviews, no social media, but each week she mailed a letter. Cream envelope, rounded script, no return address. The post office clerk knew her, but never asked. The letters went to families of victims, former teachers, and mothers who'd buried children without justice. None named names, none begged sympathy, but each carried a calm strength, like she was offering something the system had tried to erase. One family recalled opening a letter that read, "I may not know your child's name, but I've seen that same look in the mirror on the day a gun pointed at me. I lived, and I vow not to let that look appear on anyone else." Another letter reached a teacher punished for filming abuse. "You weren't wrong to record. The wrong was forcing you to choose between your conscience and your job." He was reinstated, not promoted, but said, "Without that letter, I'd have thought I was the problem. Now I know, I just didn't look away." No one knows how many letters she sent, but whenever a new victim appeared in the news, the post office received another. Adrienne never expected replies. For her, each message was a shield against silence. Not everyone has someone arrive on the 5th second, but if a single sentence could keep someone from feeling alone when it happens again, it was worth sending, even unsigned. One late afternoon, as the last sunlight cast long shadows across the porch steps, the old woman opened her mailbox, as she did every Friday. Among the usual bills and advertisements, there was a small postcard, the back hand-drawn with an image of a brick wall, unnamed, unmarked. She went inside, sat in the old wooden chair by the window, and opened it. Inside was only one line. "I did not lose my child, but I understand the feeling of seeing your child unable to lift their head." The handwriting was firm, each word carefully chosen, without a single erasure. She read it again and again. The words named no one, explained nothing, but she knew she was not mistaken. The sender did not need to sign, because that simple silence made the letter unmistakable. Her son did not die that year, but after the slap in the schoolyard for not following orders properly, he had withdrawn into himself. The boy who once held his head high, argued passionately, and said he wanted to be a lawyer, now only replied with a nod or a glance. For her, that postcard was not consolation but acknowledgement that pain takes many forms. And sometimes the deepest pain is seeing your child live on, as if hiding from themselves. She pressed the card into the family photo frame, not because it was beautiful, but because it reminded her she was not alone in her pain. Elsewhere in the city, a group of students gathered in a shared apartment. They were having a small discussion. No cameras, no hashtags, just paper and attentive eyes. One asked, "If it's our turn, who will step up first?" A girl answered, "I'm not sure I'm brave enough, but if I had to stand still like she did, I think I could." The group was silent for a few seconds. They all knew who she was, though her name was never mentioned. In that story, what mattered was not identity, but action. She never wanted to be anyone, not a symbol, not a hero, not the center of any movement. She had lived kindly enough not to need the spotlight, and bravely enough not to shy from a stare. Yet now, without ever stepping onto a stage or posting a single message, everyone wanted to be like her, at least once in their life. No one said they wanted to be Adrienne Rowe. or any other name. They just wanted to be able to stand still when they should run, hold their heads up when they ought to bow, and let their presence become an undeniable truth. In a room, at a train station, or on a street corner where justice often lags. They did not want fame. They just did not want to be buried in silence like those before them. The mirror she left behind was not a mirror that reflected her, but one that made others ask themselves, if it were me, could I stand there? And because that question still has no certain answer, they keep mentioning her, even without saying her name, not to glorify, but to keep that awareness from being forgotten, amid lives rushing by and indifference so easy to accept. She never claimed to be brave, but thanks to her, others began searching for their courage, not through grand declarations, but by choosing not to look away, not bowing when called the wrong name, not backing down when a gun is drawn, and not staying silent when someone beside them is targeted. Maybe the world has not changed yet, but one by one, people are starting to stand still, even for just 5 seconds, to remind each other that justice does not need to be shouted. It only needs to show up at the right moment, just as she did when all that remained was the distance between a gun and a heart full of trust. At a national conference on civil reform and oversight of abuse in public service, a packed hall of legal experts, watchdogs, activists, and academy reps listened as a young delegate proposed including the case of the black woman who stood still before a gun. Though she took no action, he said, she forced an entire system to reflect. His words hung in silence. The moderator glanced at his notes, then said, "The case remains too sensitive. Naming individuals in official curricula may be seen as biased." Light tapping on tables followed, but no one truly closed the discussion. An elderly scholar stood, no notes in hand, his presence alone commanding attention. Once imprisoned for exposing wartime abuses, he stepped forward. If we're afraid to name someone who stood still at gunpoint, what exactly are we reforming? Are laws meant to preserve power or protect the people the barrel points at? As whispers spread, he continued, this is not glorification. It's recognition. If a court-confirmed truth caught on camera is still too sensitive, are we rewriting justice in shades of gray? One military delegate nodded. A young reporter took rapid notes. The name Walter Jefferson was crossed out in one document. No one denied what the woman or Walter did. Still, the silence, willful or not, turned a moral standard into an avoided subject. Someone suggested anonymizing the case. The scholar didn't react, only said, if we can't even name the person, don't pretend we're changing behavior. People learn from truth, not shadows stripped of soul. The vote was delayed. Attendees looked around, not to argue but to wonder. If they had to draft this reform, would they name the woman who faced a gun? Or settle for a clean, uncontroversial list? Outside, students waited with no signs raised, just a black and white photo on a wooden board. A woman in a white suit, eyes locked with the camera, a gun trembling in front of her. Below it, one line, if you don't dare say the name of the one who stood still, then you've stood with the one who pulled the trigger. As the conference wrapped, papers handed out and votes cast, a young tech assistant stepped quietly to the final slide controls. No one noticed until the screen behind him flickered on. No title, no name, just one stark image, the woman in white, standing firm in the street, a gun near her head, her gaze unwavering. The entire hall fell silent. Some people sat up straighter. A few squinted as if to make sure this was a real photo, not a reenactment. Someone considered asking, who authorized showing this? But the question was never voiced, because that moment allowed no interruptions. 1 second, 2 seconds. Then applause broke out from the corner of the hall. It was solitary but firm. The person clapping was a young female cadet from the Federal Security Academy, someone who had once attended the lesson where the instructor told them to place their hand on the nameless brick wall for 5 seconds. That applause echoed like a heartbeat in a room that had just been awakened. Then, another person stood, and another. No one mentioned her name, yet row after row stood, clapping in unison with a reflex never taught in any curriculum. There were no slogans, no speeches, and no cameras recording. It was simply a spontaneous act from people who had spent almost an entire day in reform meetings, only to remember at the very end who those reforms were for. The young man at the control table pulled the plug on the projector. The screen went black again, as if nothing had ever appeared. But no one sat down. They stood in silence a few seconds longer, without prompting, without guidance. It was no longer just a photograph. It was a reminder that needed no translation. Outside the meeting room, the afternoon sun slanted along the glass hallway. A group of students waited for a representative's autograph. Among them was a boy of about 17, dressed in a white t-shirt and dark jeans, holding a photocopy of an article about the Walter Jefferson case. When asked why he cared about this, he just smiled, then looked at the poster outside the hall, where an unnamed courtroom scene, a character with no biography, and an action needing no caption were displayed. "I do not need to know her name," he said. "I just need to know what to do if I am ever threatened." His voice was steady, not angry or indignant, but as firm as the way the woman in the photo had stood, as if resolve could pass from one generation to the next if it was remembered the right way. An official nearby bowed to the students before turning away, but one hand tightened in his pocket, not out of anger or objection, but like a silent promise that this story would not be left behind closed files. That day, no one signed her name onto official records. No honors were bestowed, but an entire hall rose for a moment they could not name, for an act they had not dared before, and for a person who, even without being recorded, was now inscribed into their shared reflex: stand still, do not bow, and look straight at what is wrong without flinching. The pencil drawing had no color or caption. Though the A4 paper was slightly wrinkled, the lines were bold and intentional. A woman in a white suit stood upright, eyes forward, unflinching. The gun pointed at her forehead was tilted slightly off-center, just enough to mean she lived, though still the image carried motion, as if something violent had been stopped by something silent and invisible. A child had drawn it, and the teacher pinned it to the whiteboard, surrounded by lesson notes. It didn't shout for attention, but students often lingered, drawn to its quiet weight. One day, a young girl paused longer and said softly, "Maybe you're strongest when you don't shout." The teacher wrote that sentence beneath the drawing in red ink. It wasn't part of any curriculum, but it stayed in students' minds. When asked why the woman didn't step back, a boy answered, because she believed he'd arrive in time. There was light laughter, not mocking but gentle, as if easing the pressure of something hard to name. The teacher nodded, saying nothing more. Later, a man in a police badge and office suit came to the classroom. He read the red words and asked, "Who drew this?" The teacher stayed silent, but a small girl stepped forward. "I did. My mom showed me the video. She said I should know when to speak and when to stand still." The man looked at her for a long time, then gently placed his hand on her head, not as a lesson, but as a quiet recognition of something he couldn't undo. The drawing was never entered in a contest, nor did it win any awards. It didn't need to. It became part of the room, a pause in the noise. Some things don't need applause. They just need to be there, reminding us to ask what we'd do if we saw someone with a gun to their head just because of their skin. In the corner, faint pencil words later appeared. "If I grow up and forget, I hope I remember I once drew someone who didn't bow." There was no name, but someone, somewhere, had grown a little through that drawing. Walter stood silently before it one afternoon, after a community security meeting. No one had invited him. He wasn't expected, but there he was, in full uniform, buttons fastened, hands folded. He said nothing. The sun from the window caught the edge of the paper clip and threw a small reflection on the desk. And still he stood there, just long enough for something to settle. The drawing stayed the same. The woman in a white suit, the gun turned aside, the husband stepping in, shadows crossing the ground. This time, in the quiet, Walter picked up a black marker and wrote beneath the old words, "But sometimes you have to speak up at the right moment, so others do not have to stand still like that. He signed nothing, just left the message clear, as if stepping into the story again without fear. One student quietly recorded the moment but did not share it online. Instead, they printed the image and taped it into a notebook, adding, "Sometimes just being there is all someone else needs." That line spread quietly among students. Showing up whenever someone was treated unfairly or left out, stand in the right place, or look straight, do not turn away, became their reminder. The teacher later said, "I once thought teaching rules was enough, but what matters is helping them see what should not be obeyed." Walter's new line and the old drawing were copied to other schools, showing up in lessons about justice. Each time, the reminder felt new. A single moment of courage can break through prejudice. After class, Walter did not tell anyone what he wrote. He sat in his car, the words echoing in his mind, no longer just his wife's story, but a question for everyone. How many people failed to speak up, and how high was the cost? The lesson was not in the verdict or the laws, but in the habit of pausing before looking away. Change started with small acts, a presence, a word at the right time, reminding a whole community that justice grows not in courtrooms, but wherever someone chooses not to turn away. Under the slogan, "Record, Don't Look Away," a grassroots campaign was launched by a group of lawyers, educators, and those who had witnessed injustice but had never been heard. It didn't rely on tragic images to provoke sympathy, nor did it exploit negative emotions. Instead, it used short clips, each less than 30 seconds long, capturing only one thing: human reactions when faced with abuse of power. A young woman filmed two officers ordering a homeless man to empty his bag. A middle-aged man recorded his cousin being detained at a gas station for no clear reason. An elderly woman, from a distance, captured the confused expression of a black boy pulled over on his way to tutoring. These clips had no climax, no shouting, no violence, but that stillness made viewers uneasy. From there, an unspoken rule spread: if you can't intervene, at least record. Not to shame, but to protect, so no one can pretend it didn't happen, and if needed, to recount the truth, especially when the voice of the vulnerable is most doubted. Local police gradually realized the campaign's reach as more of these clips appeared regularly on short-form video platforms. Not all went viral, but what concerned them was the uncertainty: who was filming, from what angle, and whether the footage could become evidence. Some officers resisted, ordering citizens to stop recording or threatening to confiscate phones. Yet over time, due to public pressure and civil rights involvement, changes emerged. Some departments held retraining sessions, others tested internal recording systems. Their caution stemmed not from fear of punishment, but from the fear of being seen clearly when no longer controlling the lens. The campaign never launched through national media. It spread quietly, school to school, neighborhood to neighborhood, in churches and community spaces. As a simple reminder, if you see something wrong, don't look away, and if you can, record. No need for moral lectures or complex theories, just a simple act. Turn the camera on, hold it steady, and stand your ground, as the woman in the story once did. In a neighborhood with a history of racial tension, a city council-sponsored session brought together police and residents. There, a mid-ranking officer admitted that since patrol videos became public, complaints about excessive force dropped by over 30%. No one claimed the camera was a perfect solution, but at least it reminded everyone that someone was watching. And sometimes being watched changes behavior. In a youth class on civic rights, a teacher played a simple clip. An officer asks to search a black woman's bag. She stays silent, but the person behind her lifts a phone. The officer instantly softens his tone and ends with a thank you. No one applauded, but as the clip ended, one student whispered, "I'd do the same if I saw someone being mistreated." No grand promise, just a new reflex taking root. A young officer, 2 years into the force, stood at a closed seminar where peers shared experiences of being filmed. He wasn't outspoken and had no record of misconduct, but that day he asked to speak. "I used to think cameras were the enemy," he said calmly. "I thought they hunted us, edited unfairly, made the job harder." He paused. "But now, I think they're mirrors. Mirrors don't lie. If we see something wrong, the problem isn't the mirror." No one clapped. But soon after, a petition was signed across the class asking that each officer watch 30 minutes of their footage weekly. People don't change because of lectures. They change when someone voices what they've been afraid to admit, and then dares to change it. That same weekend, across the city, his wife visited a bookstore near their old neighborhood. No scarf, no sunglasses, no husband with her. The bookseller recognized her but said nothing, just offered a chair. She chose a medical book, sat quietly, still wearing her wedding ring and the same pearl necklace once mocked by a cop. No one approached her, but behind her, high school students debated filming injustice. She never asked to be recorded, one girl said, but because someone did, now we all know that just standing still can be enough. She made no speeches, raised no fist, asked for no help, but her silent defiance held weight. A media professor later said, "Some heroes don't act. They just stay where they are and make the world stop." And from that day on, every quiet act of courage carried a part of her, reminding us that truth doesn't always need to shout, but it must never be cut short. She never appeared on magazine covers, but in professional ethics classes at security academies across the country, a brief moment recurs every term. The instructor displays a slide of a woman in a white suit facing a gun barrel. Without a caption, without a soundtrack, the image stays up for exactly 3 seconds before fading. No explanation is given, yet in that short pause, some students stop writing, others take a deep breath as if trying to dislodge a weight caught in their throat. And in those 3 seconds, many begin to consider their instinct when facing wrongdoing, not to judge who's right, but to ask what they would do. One evening, in a quiet neighborhood, a young girl paused in front of a TV screen, replaying an old clip. She turned to her mother and asked, "Is that the woman who didn't run away?" The mother didn't answer right away. She looked closely at the face on the screen. The eyes didn't scream, didn't plead. They simply stared back at the gun, as if to say, "I will not flinch." Then she nodded, held her daughter's hand, and said, "Yes." And because of that, the bad man didn't have time to pull the trigger. The story never needed a name, yet people remembered her as a turning point, not because she performed some heroic act, but because she didn't act on the instinct to flee. Her quiet presence at what seemed to be the end became the beginning of a long awakening. Walter, the husband in uniform that day, never used the event to build a personal brand. When asked in a closed interview whether she ever regretted standing still before a gun, he replied with just one sentence: "She knew the consequences. But she stood still. That was enough." This wasn't a victory in the traditional sense. There was no trophy parade, no flag raised atop a building, but it ended with something deeper, a new reflex seated in people's minds. Since that day, hundreds of citizen shot videos have helped overturn cases long ignored. Phrases like "record it, don't look away" stopped being slogans and became moral instructions. A child may not know what's legally right, but knows to pull out a phone when someone's pinned against a wall. A bystander no longer looks down when they meet a frightened gaze from someone stopped without cause. From a single moment of stillness in a supermarket aisle, the story spread like ripples, soft but steady. People began to understand that sometimes standing still isn't surrender, but the boldest action, because to hold your ground while others tremble under the weight of power takes more courage than shouting ever could. And that silent courage made it impossible for a society to keep ignoring the unjust gun. Today, her name isn't mentioned in media campaigns. But each time a police officer hesitates for a few seconds because they see calm eyes staring back, that reflex traces back to one woman who didn't back down. The story ends not with revenge, not with a goal scored, but in awareness, in how people now choose to watch more closely, record earlier, and speak up at the right moment. This isn't an ending. It is a quiet strike at the conscience, where a woman, without taking the spotlight, made everyone stop to listen.